with the plastic around the...
Do you have any tape?
No, I don't have any tape. Just rubber bands here. If you're listening at home and you hear some crinkling, folks, it's because we have some fancy rubber bands to hold a plastic bag on our camera because it's drizzling right now. So.
Any more tape on here? I try to keep pieces of gaffer tape just available. You play with gaffer tape because you can keep unsticking it. And
okay. We should be ready to go. Off mute, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm off mute.
So, all right.
I'll read you questions if you want for private.
Questions for Grant on the iPad here. So.
Okay, when we start taking questions, then I can read them.
Yeah. So just make sure that we're in the frame over here.
You are good.
All right. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Fitz, and I'm a park ranger here at Katmai National Park and Preserve. And today we're doing another one of our live web chats on, and Explore.org is a partnership, or has a partnership with Katmai National Park that allows us to stream our bear cams here along the Brooks River. And we're very, very thankful for their funding and their support to get the bear cams live and out to the rest of the world. So it's really kind of an amazing partnership that we have with them. And joining me today, to my left here, is Grant Hildebrand, and he's a wildlife biologist with the Alaska region of the National Park Service. So he actually isn't out here all that often. You came out once last year, I guess.
Yeah, I usually come out about maybe 6 days a year, but it's always a good 6 days.
Okay, yeah, it's a little bit different than Anchorage from here. And I'll be interviewing Grant about some of his research that he's done in the past with bears and about nutrient cycling in the ecosystem. He's discovered some really interesting things. And we'll also be talking about his methodology, at least with tranquilizing bears, because he was very much involved and kind of ran the show when we were looking to remove the wire snare from Divot just a few weeks ago. So Grant has a PhD in zoology, and your dissertation was sort of associated with the flow of marine isotopes in terrestrial ecosystems. Can you kind of describe what you worked on when you were studying that? Yeah,
well, really, we were curious about was how important salmon are to bears, how important they are to the ecosystem. And it's, it's important for a lot of different reasons. The way we first started, or the reason we first started, is in the lower productions. Salmon had largely diminished in the areas due to the hydroelectric development of the dams that were in place. And so we're really curious how much the bears that existed in those areas before the dams relied on fish. And the reason we were so curious is we wanted to know, if we were to reintroduce bears into these areas, what were some realistic expectations for those populations relative to their status, their health, number of bears we might see, density, how productive they would be. And without salmon being there, would we expect them to be feeding on other things, potentially concerns about depredation, that kind of thing. So ironically, we actually started looking at bears and salmon because we were curious about how bears would do without salmon.
Okay. Yeah, it's some really cool stuff, some things that I've actually used as almost like my primary research material for some of the programs that I've done here. Once I realized how important salmon were to the ecosystem, it's kind of opened up a whole world to how everything is interacting around here. Yeah. And I did forget to mention something before we move on to some other questions, is that if you're watching on the internet and you want to submit questions, if you're watching on explore.org, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and submit questions in the comment stream down there. So below all the icons for the other cams, you can submit questions there, and then we will have somebody from explore.org filtering those and sending us to me, and I'll be able to read those a little bit later on. Or if you're watching on some other feed and you are maybe not on explore.org, you can go to Twitter, if you have a Twitter account, and just use the hashtag BearCam, all one word, to submit questions through there. And you also can't see, but we do have a studio audience with us here today. So we have some BearCam fans watching us right now, which is actually kind of the normal way that we do programs. They're usually not staring at a camera like Roy and I do often here. So please submit us questions. We'll try to get to a few of those later on in the chat here. But I was kind of curious, again, Grant, about your background. So what really, piqued your interest in this sort of dynamic between bears and salmon? Was there something in your past you got really interested in, or you just kind of stumbled upon the topic?
Well, I think, probably my experience was similar to just about anyone who's come to Alaska and actually seen salmon in the ecosystems. I mean, it's almost spiritual when you see spawning salmon. And what's so unique about this fish is it leaves the freshwater, about this big and comes back 3 or 4 years later. And we're talking about fish that are about this big. So there's this massive intake or growth that occurs out in the marine environment. And when those fish return to spawn, all of those nutrients are somehow deposited into the freshwater ecosystem, the terrestrial ecosystem. And so, when you walk the landscape, or you fly over, you can tell which streams have fish and which don't. I mean, the whole system is just far more productive, and it's just the lifeblood of coastal Alaska. And so it's just an amazing phenomenon. And I think, having spent time in the Pacific Northwest, where that used to be the case and no longer is, it's really fascinating to see and to study.
And we have our bus tour just arriving, so if you hear a big engine, that's what it happens to be. Just a heads up for everybody. Yeah, but I found that dynamic really, really fascinating myself, and even thinking about Atlantic salmon too.
Sure.
I mean, there used to be giant runs of Atlantic salmon throughout New England, much of the maritime provinces of Canada, into Europe as well.
Yeah.
We're just not seeing that anymore. So the ecology of those areas has really shifted, based on the presence or absence of salmon. So we know that salmon or that bears are in Alaska especially are very much dependent on salmon. But can you maybe describe for us how salmon influence the productivity of bears, sort of on a individual level maybe,
Sure,
and a population level too, because it varies from bear to bear, of course, but what we have here, the phenomenon at Katmai, is really kind of based on the salmon.
Well, in a way, if you kind of think about the economics of an individual bear, or even a bear population, the way they pay their bills is with calories. It's how they produce young, it's how they survive. And so what we have seen in areas where we have salmon available versus an area where we don't have salmon available, the density will be 10 to 20-fold higher, meaning it's not uncommon to see places where you've got 400 bears per 1,000 square kilometers in salmon areas, and those densities, rather than being 400, are at 20 in non-coastal areas. In terms of the individual bears, we see a dramatic difference in body size. In interior area, we'll see an adult female that maybe on average is a couple hundred pounds. In salmon areas in the spring, they'll be 350 pounds, and they'll grow to 550 pounds. From a productivity standpoint, what that means is they can produce more cubs, they can support more cubs, they tend to produce earlier in life, and they tend to have a shorter interval between litters, meaning rather than being 4 or 5 years between litters, it may be 2 or 3 years. And so that culminates just in a lot more bears on the landscape. So.
And I've noticed here too that some of our adult females that aren't caring for cubs are just a whole lot bigger. It seems like they're able to really pack on the pounds, and they don't have to worry about devoting any energy to their offspring as well. Would you? Something that our audience is always kind of curious about, and just questions just sort of popped into my head is, how would you estimate? Would you be willing to estimate just how big some of our biggest bears here along the Brooks River are?
Sure.
I mean, we had a really big female out here earlier today on number 409 bead nose, and some of us were watching her waddle by yesterday, and she's just a hippopotamus. I mean, she's giant. So, how big would she probably weigh right now?
I think the largest female I've ever actually weighed was on the Kenai, which is also a salmon system, and she was 770 pounds in the fall. Wow. And I think these guys would be right in that same neighborhood. And in terms of the males, some of the biggest males I've handled would have been in the spring, and they would run 830 pounds. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of these males now are in that 1,100, 1,200 pound range.
Okay, so we got some monsters here. So
I don't want to weigh them because it would be way too much work. So.
Well, we'll talk about Divot in a little bit, but we had some trouble actually picking her up off of the ground, and she wasn't that big of a female. Oh yeah. Oh no, I lifted her up with one arm. That's what I was supposed to say.
We wouldn't have been able to do it without Roy. So that's what it really came down to.
And your research in a sort of analyzing the bones of bears and the tissues of bears in the past suggested that this dynamic between bears and salmon has been going on for many thousands of years, especially in the Columbia River watershed, and that's not something that people can observe today.
Correct. Yeah, so the way, the particular technique that Mike's asking about, the way that it works, if you think about, it starts with you are what you eat. And so the way we assess what bears consume is actually at an atomic level. And so we can use different isotopes to trace the origin of the carbon and nitrogen that's found in their tissues. And so in this particular case, and this goes back to where we're curious about how much how much bears relied on salmon before the dams went in. So we actually went to museums and collected small pieces of bone from skulls that were collected in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And from that we extracted collagen, did the analysis. And what we found is that the bears that occurred in areas where fish historically were present, anywhere from about 30 to 60% of the carbon and nitrogen found in that collagen actually was marine in origin. So historically that dependence at that point in time is very similar to what we see presently in Alaskan populations that have access to fish.
So that's I think really a fascinating aspect to consider when you consider just how large that watershed is. I mean, the Columbia River watershed goes. I can't remember how long the river actually is, but it's well over 1,000 miles.
Yeah.
So bears in Idaho, potentially even Wyoming, were probably feeding on salmon sometime in the past, and that's just not happening today.
Yeah.
So I think all of this information sort of demonstrates the importance of salmon to wildlife populations. So do you think this poses an extra set of challenges for people who are managing salmon, for instance? Because we want to have commercial fishing, we want to have that food resource, we want to have that means of making a living here in Alaska too, but we also want to have rich, abundant wildlife as well.
No, I think it definitely is a challenge. On the fisheries side, you've got desire to meet the commercial needs. Folks enjoy sport fishing. There's subsistence needs for people to rely on fish. At the same time, allowing those nutrients to travel upstream is incredibly important to support not just the bears, but the birds, the microbes. It really drives that whole system. So it's this balancing act of wanting to ensure healthy ecosystems, which in turn will support healthy future salmon populations while allowing for a level of harvest that's sustainable. So it's definitely a challenge. Yeah.
And a lot of the studies that you authored it kind of involved tracking the movements of individual bears, like on the Kenai Peninsula.
Yeah.
Is that where you gained experience, tranquilizing bears?
Yeah. I've been really lucky through the years. I think I've probably, handled, give or take, probably 800 bears throughout the state, everywhere from Gates of the Arctic to Denali to parts of Kodiak, Kenai, Nelchina, and so it's definitely part of what we do. We're always, really thoughtful, and we start with what's our information need, what's the fundamental issue, and what's the best way to try and go out and collect that. And at times, the collaring work seems to be the most appropriate tool, but it's not something that I or my colleagues take lightly either, because it involves a certain level of stress and risk, not just to the animals, but to the staff as well.
And I think that question kind of leads in to some questions about 854 divot.
Sure.
So you came out and with your help we were able to remove the snare from around her neck. So with divot, a lot of people are familiar with her story, but if you're not familiar with the story of this bear, she was a bear that was known to use the Brooks River for many years, probably raised as a cub right here along the Brooks River. And we didn't really see her much over the past couple years or so, but we saw her last year for a little bit with some spring cubs. We saw her in July this year with 2 yearling cubs. That was about the middle of July. And then at the end of July, she came back and she had what appeared to be a wire snare tightly wound around her neck. Yeah. So we the park sort of mobilized to try to take action to help the bear to remove the wire snare. So when you first heard about this, it was kind of pretty late at night, right? Weren't you scrambling in the evening to try to get ready to come out the next day?
Yeah. I think Troy gave me a call on the way home from work, and so then it was just a matter of one, just kind of getting the gear together, and the biggest thing was just trying to physically get from there to here. But I think I was here by about noon the next day, so it all fell into place pretty well. But yeah, hopped on a plane, hopped on another plane, and the plane landed in the lake, and I jumped from the float of the plane into a boat, and then we went to work. So
I was actually kind of amazed that we were able to kind of get
Yeah.
things ready so quickly, because nothing happens fast in Bush, Alaska.
No,
It's,
no.
We're 300 miles southwest of Anchorage in our location right here, so Grant had to take a flight in the King Salmon and then eventually come out to Brooks Camp. And we had the hope that the bear was still around too,
Yeah.
which I really didn't think that she would stick around, because we saw her so infrequently.
And we needed good weather, so yeah, it all worked out. Yeah.
So we were able, to kind of conclude the story. We were able to when I say we, I shouldn't say we. I should say Grant. Grant did help the heavy lifting with Divot, but eventually the wire snare was removed successfully from her. And if people are looking for some of the backstory on this, some of our blog posts that we've done, there's also a video that Roy happened to edit, and that's all up on Katmai's YouTube page. And then if you go on Katmai National Park's main page, there's a blog post that I wrote in the Katmai Terrain blog about the Divot sort of saga and story. So if you want those links, I'm sure someone can post them in the comment stream on explore.org. But some things that I think people might be really sort of fascinated with is maybe the methodology that you go through when you're looking at a bear, you're targeting that animal study, or in this case,
Yeah.
to remove the wire snare. What are some of the things that go through your mind? When you're, is it, I'm looking at an adult female. Is that different from if I'm looking at an adult male?
Yeah.
And how much tranquilizer you're using is based on weight,
Yep.
things of that nature.
Yeah, I think it starts with just the terrain, the temperature. What we worry about more than anything is water, and that's why it was worth trying to catch this particular bear, because she was compromised. But I normally it's not a place I would want to anesthetize the bear, because that's really our biggest fear is getting a bear anesthetized close to water. Beyond that, the other things that we're thinking about in terms of bear size, the drug that most of us use for bears, it's a really nice tool. It has a combination of different drugs in there, but it has an analgesic effect, so they're not going to feel pain. It's a dissociative anesthetic, and so what that means, they really don't recall much of the process that goes on. And the other part is when they're out, it's a nice, relaxed type of anesthesia. In other words, they're not rigid, they're not fighting it, they're pretty relaxed. So it's a nice drug. It has a very wide safety margin in that we can basically overdose by about 4 times the normal amount, and they're not gonna suffer any consequences from that. The things that you're thinking about in terms of shot placement, we want to get it into a muscle mass, because basically it'll be taken up more quickly by the bloodstream, which means the animal's going to go down more quickly, which is good, because when they get into trouble, it's from the time you actually dart the animal until the time that they go down. So you want that as short as possible. Also, if you get into muscle mass, it means they're going to process it quicker, so they'll recover more quickly. The flip side, if you get it to a fat depot, it's almost like an IV drip. So they're just getting a little bit at a time, and the reason is that there's very little vascularization in fat tissue. So they go down really slowly, and they wake up really slowly. And so that's what we're looking for. And so for people that saw the video, that's why I chose to shoot her in the front shoulder. It's a nice spot. The rump's a bigger target, but given that she already had put some weight on, it just wasn't an ideal location. We do use different doses based on animal size, and that just kind of comes, with a certain level, of experience. The thing with darting is, it's not hard to hit them. It's probably the biggest thing is just knowing when it's safe to capture an animal, when it's not. It's more the judgment than the actual physical act of doing the darting, I would say.
And I remember you, before we took any action, we were just sort of mobilizing on the lakeshore, telling us that we want to be careful of the lake.
Yeah.
The lake is bad news for the bear.
Yeah.
So when she sort of started to stumble, I mean, she went down right on the beach. I guess it was kind of really ideal based on the
Yeah.
situation that we had.
I was sure I was going to go swimming that day, and I'm very glad I didn't. So yeah.
In the 1970s here, at first, sort of maybe hind
Yeah.
legs went down first. Um, was that, again, really typical of the way that bears
Yeah.
end up reacting
Yeah.
to this drug?
Yeah, this particular drug, every bear reacts that way. They go down, back in first. It kind of progresses more slowly. The last thing that goes down is their head, and really kind of once they settle in, then you know that they're in good shape. You kind of approach from the back and just check on them, make sure that they're okay. And then they wake up in exactly the opposite order. They'll kind of start moving their lips and moving their tongue and eventually kind of lifting their head a little bit, and they kind of wake up in reverse order. And I think you guys had some footage of the recovery, and you can kind of see that too. And yeah, that's a really typical response. And what's nice about it is it kind of gets them planted in one spot. So.
In the cub too, a lot of times people are wondering, what's
Yeah.
the cub's reaction? And in the video, I think you can see what the cub was doing. It really wanted to stay close to mom. It didn't like the situation. I think maybe the situation was most stressful on the cub.
Yeah, and that cub's response was typical. Also, they don't tend to run off; they tend to stay close by. The vast majority of the capture work we do, we're using helicopters as a base, and even in those cases, a lot of times we'll dart the mom, and the cubs will stay right with her. When we come in and land, a lot of times they'll run off maybe 50 yards or so, but they'll just kind of sit and watch us work. And as soon as we back off, they come back in and get back together with her. So it's definitely something we're always thinking about and always concerned about. But in all the years of doing this, we've never had a situation where we've had cubs and mom get separated where they didn't come back together. So yeah, they're a pretty tight bond. So.
And we've had a chance to actually see 854 divot here
Yeah. Yeah.
during the past couple of weeks or so fishing. It looks like she's gained a lot of weight since that time. So
Yeah.
do you, I don't know if you'd be willing to share your like a semi or a professional
Yeah.
assessment of how she appears to be doing, because people are always kind of wondering about
Yeah.
updates about her health. And from my perspective, she looks a-okay, but I'm kind of wondering about what you see.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, she looks healthy body size wise. Her cub is roly-poly. Her cub looks really healthy to me. In terms of the wound, it's an ugly. Sorry, I thought someone just ran into something. It was a fairly ugly wound, but it wasn't terribly deep. I think she's going to heal up just fine from that. Not to diminish it, but compared to the things bears do to each other, that was actually a fairly minor wound in the big picture. And so I don't have any reason to think she won't be just fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's good news for a lot of the divot fans who happen to be out there. Other questions from the audience in just a few minutes here. But we're coming up on almost a half hour in. So one of the if you're not watching on Field.org and go on Twitter and use the hashtag Bears, all one word. So let's see what we got here. I didn't have really a whole lot of time to browse the questions when we were chatting before. But we had, every time the extent that I was here, I don't know if you okay. And you think that there may be there's been a lot of questions about when you separate the plants, how can it be shot on the first time I saw it, it was real effective that running around the house, hauling a lot and searching with his nose in the ground, really looking for out. But the next day we saw it really going back to the people are wondering, and I'm kind of wondering with myself, whether or not, well, how important is it for that to be shown by mom where the game is? I've already spread the image out here. I guess I was saying in the past, it's very, very politically responsive. And I've noticed that it can be very warm. Almost as soon as we have a day, honestly, last year. And we're going to record it pretty short. Yeah. So we'll kind of cover it. We'll see. Yeah, so if you can give us a follow-up message, if you can say to me whether that's the status with the signal or status. Okay. On the subject of training, though, we talked about a really young child and how it would be very important to learn. But what about, older bears? People are always kind of wondering if the tracking system can survive. We can look at any of the really, really big tracking that we have a couple of speed. But besides maybe the risk of starting with them, anything else that can affect their survival or something like that? this typically happens. That was one of the early times, but I see myself looking at my life. It's kind of weird. So I'm still looking at stuff like that. So it seems like maybe it's still doing it. So I apologize for that, but if you're not quite sure. Yeah, maybe a little bit red. Because they're a little bit covered up. Yeah, the headphones. Yeah. So, again, thanks for sticking with our technical difficulties here. So, a lot of people are kind of wondering too about the hibernation sort of physiology is really fascinating as well. This kind of a basic question is that, do they eat snow or do they drink anything when they're in the den?
Which ones?
That one's mine on that side. So
This is actually low battery is what I'm getting. I could shut itself off, so we could just swap
Uh-oh.
batteries out.
okay.
Well, I can hear you fine on mics.
I'll just leave it off then.
Yeah. I'm trying to kill this one. There we go. Okay.
Okay. So we're going to plug away here for just a little bit. Again, I apologize for our technical issues that tends to happen out here where we are. We don't have a professional production studio. It's just myself and Roy, who knows the tech a lot better than I am, or I do.
And Mother Nature.
And Mother Nature too, which is not necessarily cooperating today. So we are live here at the Brooks River. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm a park ranger here at Katmai. And let me see if I can find some questions on explore.org right now, because I didn't see any immediately in Skype. But we'll get on the web here and see. Oh, and last time I checked, though, there was 333 new comments, 369 now. So there's a lot of people that are joining us. So I hope you're enjoying the show. Yeah, do we have any questions from our live audience here? So while I'm waiting for my screen to refresh. No. Disaster.
Grant, I have a question.
Sure, yeah, please.
So they can hear you. We'll stand by Mike.
You don't have to be on camera. You can just step over here. That's fine. We do have a few people watching us here today. So.
I understand that you found some bears denning together that are related to other family groups or have longer term relationships than we thought previously. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a particular situation of multiple family groups standing together. We definitely find them hanging out together, throughout the year, and I think places like this where they're not competing for food quite so much. They tend to be a lot more social that way. On the denning side, I just can't think of a case where that I know of in particular where we had kind of multi generations outside of sow and cubs, or immediate cubs, denning together. So I can't think of one, but yeah.
And
Some adults that are related might den together, correct?
Sure. Oh yeah. Maybe if I missed the question, I'm sorry. So yeah.
well, people are wondering actually whether or not the adopted cub that we have here is going to den with its adopted mother. And I don't know. I guess we could just speculate. I don't think we're ever going to know.
It's a pretty novel situation, and she seems very tolerant of that, that older cub, hanging out with them. I'm not sure the spring cub's all that thrilled with the arrangement, to be honest with you. But I'd be really curious if they all come out together next spring, and if there's still a family group there. But that's, it's part of what's so interesting and fascinating. It's part of what I like about the job is you never see it all. There's always something new that'll amaze you and make you ponder. So I don't know how that'll play out this fall.
So this is Roy. You've told me a particular story of like one of the more unusual family relationships that you've encountered. You know which one I'm referring to?
You need to coach me a little bit.
The family,
yes,
the family group that you.
Yeah, no, I had a colleague.
Oh, it wasn't you. Okay.
A colleague on Kodiak, and they were out collaring bears, and they darted a female with offspring, and started to work her up and process her and do what you do, and rolled her over, and it was actually a male. So it was a male that had a small cub that was hanging out with it. And that was a surprise to him, and it was a big surprise to me when told me the story. But it's hard to mistake one for the other. So I have no doubt that it was a male with the young one hanging out with it. So.
And I like that story because it's just like fascinating on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Because there's that misconception or that myth rather that all male bears will always eat cubs when they
Right.
find them, and
Right.
so here's an example, just completely reset
Yeah.
everybody's expectations and understanding, at least in that particular situation.
Yeah, I think so. It was. Yeah, I think I definitely agree that it's not every male is a bloodthirsty cub killer by any stretch of the imagination. That was just a really unique level of tolerance that we just we weren't aware of before. So.
And I think with bears too, we can maybe stereotype them into certain behaviors, but we probably can easily find exceptions to every rule.
Yeah.
And with adult bears killing cubs, I mean, many females have been documented to do that as well.
Sure. And occasionally they kill their own cubs, So it's not everything they do always makes sense, but I think.
Same with people, though. Yeah, you can't really pigeonhole humans into behaving in a certain way in a lot of cases.
And I think it's maybe one of the challenges with doing science and then applying it to make better management decisions is there's a tendency to always look for the average. And a lot of times what's most interesting and maybe most important isn't the average, but it's the variation that exists around that mean, if you will. So, yeah, they one of the things that we just see through time when we follow the same bears is there's this tremendous difference in how bears behave and interact with their ecosystem from one area to the next. But within a given ecosystem, different bears make different choices and have different kind of life histories. But then the same bear will do different things from one year to the next. A female that's alone will behave differently than that same female will a year later when she has cubs of the year. And then as those cubs get a little bigger, she'll behave differently again. And so there's just there's so much dynamics to what they're doing. They live in an incredibly complex world, and they're making some very complicated decisions to survive in that world. And most often they make good decisions. Sometimes they make poor decisions. So.
And your research projects are based on, I guess, making sure that we have the right information
Sure.
to manage these populations of wildlife.
You bet. No, absolutely.
So, kind of getting back to some of our audience questions here. Again, a kind of a basic question about hibernation with bears is about what elevation do bears hibernate at. In your work in Alaska, I'm sure you've seen quite a variation in the elevation.
Generally they want to be high. They tend to end up above tree line. In general, they kind of like those south-facing slopes.
a little more warmth. It'll green up a little bit earlier in the spring, and but again, a lot of different choices. Generally I feel like females often will den a little bit higher than males, and often females will stay at those den sites. They'll stay in the den quite a bit later. We were doing work in Gates of the Arctic earlier this year. We were definitely seeing kind of a temporal separation, a separation in time between when the females would move down low and when the males would move down low. And what was of interest there is relative to when moose were calving, a lot of the females were still really not present in areas where moose would be calving, whereas a lot of the males were. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question exactly, but yeah, there's some variation, but they tend to like it high. Yeah.
So actually, we have a kind of a question on salmon, and I'm not sure if you're going to. This is your area of expertise, but you end up mentioning that salmon runs in certain areas have lessened. Is there a way to, help bring them back, or is it just kind of like a natural cycle?
Well, if I remember correctly, I think what I was speaking to in that particular case was in the lower 48, where where the dams have been put in. There's just places salmon used to occur that they're not really there much at all anymore. And in those areas, you do have fish hatcheries and things like that that are helping to augment those runs. And they put in the fish ladders to try and help the fish get around the dams. And in certain places, they're talking about dam removal. And so there'll be some interesting large-scale habitat restoration that they'll have ecosystem level effects. So, but I think a big part of the desire to modify that landscape or to return it to its previous state down there has a lot to do with salmon management. So.
Okay, and a few more that have just come into the queue here. A lot of people are kind of wondering about specific weights of some of our bears here in the river, and I don't know if you know them well enough maybe to give us an estimate, but one bear that maybe is the most well-known wild bear in the world right now, who's nicknamed Otis. He's number 480. He's on the cam a lot because he sits at the falls, and he just sits in that far pool at this time of the year, nose to the water, looking for any fish that swim next to him. And sometimes he might even fall asleep in that spot too. So he's a real tubby guy. I don't know if you wanted to give a rough estimate.
Yeah, I was thinking like about 1173.47.
That's pretty precise.
That's what I was going with. He's big. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I don't know if we're going to be able to accurately, describe just some of these individual bears, but maybe just to recap, some of the big females here you were saying earlier.
So and the place where we've actually physically weighed a lot of bears where they're eating fish, which is something we haven't done here. We don't tend to handle these bears, but on the Kenai, what we'd see is our average female would be about 330 pounds in the spring coming out of the den. We'd handle them again midsummer before the salmon arrived, and on average they were about 350 pounds. And then those same bears would be about 550 pounds in the fall before they went into hibernation. So we're talking about a 200-pound weight gain over the course of 5 or 6 months, but also realize they're losing all that weight again over the course of the winter due to the cost of hibernation and cub production. And given those bears there, the bears that I see here, I think these guys are pretty comparable in size, maybe 10-15% bigger. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if some of these larger females, like I said, are in that 700 or 800 pound range. And I think the big males are again going to be, I was tongue in cheek before, but that 1,100-1,200 pound range.
Okay. Yeah, so real big males that we have here, 747, 1,100 pounds, maybe 1,200 pounds. Bear like 410, that's probably the biggest female I think we have on the river this year. Yeah,
I was within 7 feet or so of 410 not that long ago.
410's a very human.
About an hour ago, so yeah.
410's a very human habituated bear. She often likes to sleep right next to our trails. She's actually slept right under the deck where I'm standing now. And when she's down there, you can hear her, and if you don't hear her, you can smell her often. So I don't know if you were close enough to smell her today. She kind of stinks like a wet salmon-covered bear in a lot of ways. So let's see what we have next. Young bears, they're hanging out together. They're playing and wrestling. For those bears, even they're young adult males, there's probably no chance that they're going to enter the den together. They're just going to end up, parting ways.
Yeah, I think it would be unlikely that they would actually den together, but there's definitely a lot of interesting social interactions you see here, kind of the mock playing and wrestling and that kind of thing, and the non-injurious just kind of going through the motions of learning to be a big bear. And so they do interact. They obviously know each other very well. But I'd be surprised if they actually den together. So.
And one thing that's maybe outside of Roy and I's expertise, and this maybe follows up with some of the behavior that we see here along the river, is the actual trigger that sends bears into like a hyperphagic state. And hyperphagia is really just defined as excessive eating. And when bears do it in the fall, they eat and they eat and they eat, and they spend all their waking hours eating.
Yeah.
With bears like 89 and 32 that are wrestling with one another, I couldn't say that they're in hyperphagia if they're willing to expend that sort of energy.
Well, when they're eating, kind of gorging on fish, it's interesting because there's a few things that they're balancing. One is kind of gut fill. Two is how long it takes them to actually process the fish. They have a really simple GI tract. It's frankly, it's just like yours and mine, and so their passage rate is about 7 or 8 hours. And so there is some physical limit in terms of how much fish they can consume, and I think it's part of why you'll see, certain bears are, for lack of a better term, grazers. Where maybe Otis, where it's a fish an hour, but it's just constant. Others may kind of gorge a little more, but then they're going to go up and sleep, and they're just going to kind of rest and digest. And when your body's processing that much food, your body's working. It's actually, it's somewhat. There's a reason you feel lethargic after you have a big meal, and they're going through something similar. And the hyperphagic part, it's partly appetite, it's partly the food being available, but it's also partly physiologically what your body is doing with those nutrients. And when I talked about those weight gains we would see seasonally, what was interesting is not only were the weight gains different, but the way the weight was being laid down was different. In other words, commonly they would lay down mostly protein in the more and more lipids, and we tend to see that in the fall. And what's really unique here is just the abundance of fish, both during the migration and now after the fish are spawning and available. It just food is just super abundant here. It's a really unique situation.
And what about vegetation in the diet of these bears? It's something that, we notice that they're eating fish and fish and fish.
Yeah.
We do occasionally see them grazing on berries and things like that.
Yeah.
Are there certainly, micronutrients perhaps that they need in the vegetation? So every bear here can't subsist solely on salmon. Maybe they have to go eat berries or grass.
I think there's a variety of reasons that they consume, other foods. And like in terms of spring vegetation, let me step back. Partly because the GI tract of bears is so simple, is even though like we may see them eating a lot of grass, and there's a certain level of nutrition in that grass, they don't have the capacity to really process and absorb very much of that. So a lot of that passes through, and you see evidence of that all over the trails. Is even though like we may see them eating a lot of grass, and there's a certain level of nutrition in that grass, they don't have the capacity to really process and absorb very much of that. So a lot of that passes through, and you see evidence of that all over the trails here. Berries are a little bit better. They're simple sugars, and so that part's easy to digest, but you'll see a lot of the more, the denser, more fibrous parts of that is just going to pass through undigested. And I totally lost track of what the question was.
Well, I was asking a follow-up question about...
Sign of hypothermia.
No, yeah, so that's right. The other thing I was going to mention, though, is there is an advantage of having a mixed diet, not just a straight protein type diet. And you actually see that in kind of native human populations too, regardless of where they are on the planet. They tend to kind of evolve these mixed diets that include both proteins, some level of fat, and carbohydrates. And I think there's definitely some benefit to continuing to consume vegetation throughout the year. And the other part, just to be blunt, is they probably taste good. So, I like salmon. I'm not sure I want to eat it all day, every day for 2 months straight.
And I love blueberries too, one of my favorite foods, but I don't know if I could subsist solely on blueberries. I'd like to try maybe, but once my skin turns blue, I don't know if it'll be because I'm cold or because I'm because I'm eating too many blueberries.
Smurf-esque, yeah.
But so we were mentioning hyperphagia. Could you explain a little bit about that process and what would really change in the bear's behavior? Is it sort of just a seasonal thing, or would a bear that's gorging at Brooks Falls eating 20 fish in a day, would that bear be considered hyperphagic at the same time?
Yeah, I think hyperphagia is just that draw to consume calories and lay down fat that comes, as winter approaches. In terms of a kind of a physiological trigger, I don't know if it's daylight, if it's just kind of timing. I mean, because bears in areas that don't have access to fish, that don't have superabundant resources, they go through the same phenomenon. They start putting down more and more fat. It's not going to be to the same level or the same extreme that you would see here, but they go through that same process. And they're very, very seasonal animals relative to to breeding, ovulation, even the implantation. They're delayed implanters, and so even if the egg's fertilized, in June or July, it's not going to implant until November. It's really consistent in terms of when they give birth. So they obviously have some really specific physiological cues or processes that have a very seasonal component. And I think the fat accumulation that comes with hyperphagia is just one of those. So.
Okay, and you were actually earlier in the chat kind of mentioned that you once handled a bear that was 28 years old and then had a spring cub. So.
Yeah.
How long can a female really produce cubs? A bear at that age with a cub suggests that they can reproduce for their whole lives, really.
Yeah. I think that's, just in terms of an age for a wild bear, it's pretty uncommon to have a wild bear, much past the age of 30, and so we just don't see a lot out there. One of the things that's common in wild animals, and it's the same, and we see this in wolves, we see it in bears, and we see it in humans too, is just kind of a decline in muscle mass and kind of muscle density, bone density, all those kinds of things with age. So at some point, it really seems like bears, for the most part, kind of hit that period of senescence, or that wall at about the age of 30. And that particular bear that had the cub, she produced a cub. It gets harder and harder to actually rear that cub, because she's not just eating for herself, she's eating for two. And she was just to the point where she had some pretty significant challenges, just given the tooth wear and things like that she had.
And I've read actually some studies that suggest that older females that are caring for cubs probably have a less of a chance of survival, just because of the physically taxing nature, the energetically taxing nature of caring for those offspring.
Yeah, that's true.
So older moms, they have a rough go at it. So when you're watching some of those older moms on the cams, then you can, I don't know if you want to commiserate with them or not, but it's another example of just how tough of the lives that these bears lead. So it's about 4:55 now, so we'll try to get to a few questions here before we call it a day. But kind of going back to reproduction, maybe this isn't something that you studied specifically, but people know that embryos from bears, they don't start developing or really developing inside of the female until she's ready to den, or right about when she's ready to den. So what really is inhibiting the growth of that? Right. Could you explain a little bit more?
Yeah, it basically it just goes to, they call it a mid-blastula stage, and it's like a 16 or 32 cell stage. So, I mean, we're not talking about head of the pen. We're talking way smaller than that. And really, it's just, like all these other factors, they're just such seasonal animals that I think that what they found is that the right time for them to breed and focus their energy and attention on breeding is probably going to be the spring. The food becomes really, really important in the fall. That 60-day gestation gives them, kind of the right size cub. One of the other questions, we kind of struggle with is why give birth in January and have those cubs that are super, super small? Why not keep them in utero and go ahead and give birth in March or April and May, and we have a lot of wildlife to do that up here. And part of it is, I think there's some choices that she can make early on in the den if she's struggling, produces that small cub. She can choose potentially to kill a cub and not keep it. Sometimes there'll be pregnancies in utero that are aborted. The other part too is from a nutrient passage standpoint, you can kind of make some arguments. It's a little more efficient to transfer nutrients through milk than it is across the placenta. But there some things that we don't know, but really, really interesting. And again, the seasonality is just such a driving force for not just bears, but these whole Alaskan systems. I mean, everything's seasonal, and we spend a lot of time pondering, why do caribou give birth at this time, and why do moose have twins and caribou never do? So these little subtle life history traits, we don't have it all figured out, but it's certainly interesting. But it seems to work well for each individual species.
And before we end the chat, we had a little bit of sound issues back towards the middle. So some people might be wondering if we can talk a little bit about divot again,
Okay, sure.
and some of that. So I can go back to some of the other talking points that I had written down, and we can kind of conclude the chat based on that. So if you're not familiar again with that story, go to Katmai's webpage, go to Katmai's YouTube channel. You can find videos about Divot, who had a wire snare tightly kind of wrapped around her neck. And we were able to successfully remove that, really with Grant's expertise when he was here. So, when we were talking about it before, I was asking Grant to sort of describe his kind of methodology and his thought process that he goes through when he's looking at a bear and targeting it to tranquilize and handle. And so with Divot, again, could you just describe when you're looking at that bear, what are the thoughts that are going through your head?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing, and probably the most important thing, is just deciding initially, am I going to dart this bear or not? And you make that decision, and it's not about can I hit it or not. It's about what's going to happen from the time, I pull the trigger until that bear goes down. And so what we were by far most concerned about in this particular case was just all the water that was around. And it was twofold. One is, she was on a lake shore, so we had all that to contend with. The other thing is that the spot in that area where she felt safest was up the salmon stream. And so the concern is that even when they're drugged, they cover ground so much faster than us. And so we were really worried about her getting a dart in her and heading up that stream and not getting to her in time. So really, it's just when you start, it's animal safety, and it's just a manageable area. And again, were she not compromised, we wouldn't have darted her there. But given the injury we thought she had, it was worth doing. So once you decide, we're going to go ahead and pull the trigger and handle this bear, we're thinking about shot placement, and what we want is a nice muscle mass. And the reason is just like when you get injection, we want to get it into the bloodstream, get it circulating. That causes the animal to go down faster, which is safer for the animal because, again, it's covering less ground. It has less time to get in trouble from the time you dart it until the time it goes down. And then also it's going to recover more quickly too, because that drug is picked up by the bloodstream and then ultimately metabolized, and that's what leads to recovery from anesthesia. So those are a few of the things we're thinking about.
And when we were getting sort of briefed by you before we saw Divot and were able to dart her, you were going through some of those concerns you had in your head, about the lake and how we needed to keep her out of the lake. When you saw the bear and how it reacted to the drug, again, that was pretty typical of how bears react to that drug.
Yeah, that particular drug, it's a really nice drug for us to work with. It's a really nice drug for the animal in the sense that they don't feel pain when they're under anesthesia. It's a dissociative, so they're really not aware of anything that's going on when they're under anesthesia. And it's also it's a real gentle anesthetic, and what I mean is they don't get rigid and tight on it. They're pretty comfortable, and so we like that drug a lot. And they do invariably go down from the rear of the animal forward. So you'll see them get kind of drunk in their back legs, eventually kind of plant, and they'll move forward. They'll kind of go down their belly. The last thing that's up is going to be their head, and then eventually that's going to drop down too. And that's usually when we know it's safe to to get in and approach them. And then just the opposite happens when they wake up. We'll start seeing their lips move and their tongue move, and start lifting the head. And at that point, we can still do a lot of things with them, but then they'll kind of get into a push-up stance, and then you'll see them kind of start walking, and the drug just sort of wear off. And I think you guys had some of that video in the or some of that footage in the video you put together. So yeah, that was a real typical drug response and drug recovery. You know, the challenge with that one was just, thankfully, she went down in the best place possible, which was to stay on the lake shore, not get up in the vegetation, not get in the lake, and not get in the stream. And she didn't go very far either, which was good. So.
And the behavior of the cub too. We saw the cub trying to come back to us repeatedly.
Yeah.
That was again pretty typical. What you experienced.
The cubs, you know, whether they're spring cubs or yearlings or even 2-year-olds, they tend to want to stay with mom. In fact, when the 2-year-olds, because they want to stay with mom, they can be a handful and a half sometimes. Yeah, you gotta watch your 6 o'clock, but. They come say hi sometimes.
Okay. And once again, just to recap, what was the drug that you happen to use? The name of that?
The trade name's called Telazol. It's actually a combination of some different drugs, but it's the one that's by far most commonly used in the bear world. So, and we use the same drug for wolves, also coyotes and things like that. It's a nice one. It's something that it's developed for canines. Your vet probably doesn't use it because they have the option to use gas anesthesia, which is a way better way to go, but that's not really an option for us. They're not
not how much we'd like it.
Yeah, they're not particularly agreeable to getting masked. So,
and we at one point in time when we were handling her, she growled a couple times. So how conscious are they during this? So they're completely out, and that was just sort of like just an instinctual reaction, something they can't control.
Yeah, it was really almost more just kind of an exhalation. You'll get kind of these like kind of low groans and kind of rumbling sounds and stuff like that. But they'll have a blink reflex. Sometimes they'll move their jaw a bit, and it's something, just having been around a lot of animals on that drug, you get a certain level of comfort with it. But I've like I said, I've probably been part of about 800 captures. Never had a bear on this drug spontaneously aroused or surprise us that way. It's very, very predictable, which makes it safe for them, safe for us. And so it's to this point it's become kind of our standby. Years and years ago, folks used other drug combinations and had a lot of interesting stories, and you may hear those, but that was a different time with different drugs. And lucky for me, within my career, I didn't have to experience too much of that, and it's better for the animals too. So.
There were some questions. This is Roy. There were some questions when we were coming back and giving updates to people before the video was out about the cleaning of the wound and antibiotics or anything that was applied to prevent infection. Do you want to take I know it's about time, but if you take a minute and explain that.
Yeah, in this case, really all we did was, because while the wound was somewhat deep and it was an ugly wound, it really was mostly a surface wound. It didn't break below the skin layer, so we just treated it with betadine, and she should heal up just fine. They get exposed to so many things in their environment anyway that I wasn't particularly concerned about that too. The other thing with with a lot of antibiotics, they're most effective because you can give repeated treatments, and we tend to not have that option with wild animals. So while giving her something in addition certainly wouldn't have been harmful, it wouldn't have necessarily. I don't have any concerns about not giving anything else in addition to.
I know we've seen some remarkable abilities of the bears to recover from highly infected wounds, and so that was as clean as any bear wound has probably been in a while.
And it was, like I said, it was it was a wound, but the wound itself really didn't look particularly. I wasn't too concerned about infection at the time either. The color looked good, vascularization was good. So.
And how would you assess Divot's condition now? You got to see her maybe once or twice while she was here.
Yeah, no, I did. I saw her 2 days ago, which was great. And again, her cub looks great. She looks really good. She looks healthy, and I don't have any reason to think that particular incident's going to compromise her going forward at all. So.
Well, I only have one more question for Grant, and one I'm kind of curious about myself. Do you have a favorite place to watch bears? In Alaska or elsewhere?
Oh, see, I didn't know this was coming.
Yeah, see, I dropped this one. This is the tough question.
Okay,
Yeah, I gotta put you on the spot.
The true answer and the correct answer is my wife and I went on our first date, and I took her bear watching to an undisclosed location. And that particular location, which almost nobody knows about, remains to this day my favorite place to watch bears, and it always will.
All right, I'll leave it at that then.
There you go.
Well, it's a few minutes after 5 o'clock. Thanks for if you stuck with us through our technical issues. Thanks once again for doing that, and thanks to Jonathan from Explore.org and Courtney from Explore.org, who are helping us on the other end of things to get things out to the World Wide Web. Thanks to Grant for joining me today. Again, my name is Mike Fitz. I'm a park ranger here at Katmai. Roy and I will be back again to do more live chats in the future, so please stick with us for there or until then, and enjoy the bears. There's been a lot going on behind goodbye, and I'm going to enjoy some bears for the rest of the evening. So thanks for joining us, everybody.